Turn to chapter 27 in Acts. We're going to continue our study about the life of Paul. It seems like we've spent a lot of time in Acts, and we have, because that's where Paul is most frequently mentioned in the Bible. But our study has really been more about the person of Paul, the character of Paul, an effort to get to know him. And today's lesson is going to be centered around a story, a narrative story about a sea trip. The Greeks, the people in this day and time, loved loved a story about the sea. Most of the Greek stories involve sailors and things that happened at sea. And so they were always, if you wanted to get their attention with a story, you could tell the story involving the sea. And this kind of story that we're going to have today is a bit of what we call narrative theology. Now, in the story today, as we begin to read it, Christ is not necessarily presented straightforwardly. It's not a story of doctrine, but it's a story that if you read it and read it carefully, we can learn a lot about the character and power of God. A good example of narrative theology is the little handout that I gave you. I don't know if you've had a chance to read it. I emailed it to everyone on our mailing list, but I was told that a lot of people couldn't open it. So I'm going to read it, and as I read the story, notice or be looking for the message that is in the story, the narrative theology. The title is a question. Can you sleep when the wind blows? Years ago, a farmer owned land along the Atlantic seacoast. He constantly advertised for hired hands. Most people were reluctant to work on farms along the Atlantic. They dreaded the awful storms that raged across the Atlantic that would wreak havoc on buildings and crops. But as the farmer interviewed applicants for the job, he received a steady stream of refusals. Finally, a short, thin man, well past middle age, approached the farmer. The farmer asked him, "Are you a good farmhand?" And the guy said, "Well, I can sleep when the wind blows," answered the little man. Although puzzled by this answer, the farmer, desperate for help, hired him. That's what I was always looking for when I was looking for a job, someone desperate for help. The little man worked well around the farm, busy from dawn to dusk, and the farmer felt satisfied with the man's work. Then one night, the wind howled loudly in from offshore. Jumping out of bed, the farmer grabbed a lantern and rushed next door to the hired hand's sleeping quarters. He shook the little man and yelled, "Get up! A storm is coming. Tie down things before they blow away." The little man rolled over in bed and said firmly, "No, sir. I told you I can sleep when the wind blows." Enraged by the old man's response, the farmer was tempted to fire him on the spot. Instead, he hurried outside to prepare for the storm. To his amazement, he discovered that all of the haystacks had been covered with tarpaulins. The cows were in the barn. The chickens were in the coops, and the doors were barred. The shutters were tightly screwed. Everything was tied down. Nothing could blow away. The farmer then understood what his hired hand meant, and he returned to his bed to also sleep while the wind blew. So what is the moral of the story? When you are prepared, you have nothing to fear. Can you sleep when the wind blows through your life? The hired hand in the story was able to sleep because he had secured the farm against the storm before the storm came. We can secure ourselves against the storms of life by grounding ourselves in the Word of God and developing a personal relationship with Him and a confidence that God is always in control in every instance. So the question today is, can you sleep while the wind blows? Now, the story that we're going to read in chapter 27 is similar in that it's narrative theology. If you have your handout, there's I might say so myself, a really nice map that shows Paul's final missionary journey that we have a record of. And it's the one where he is taken, if you look on your map on the right-hand side, Caesarea. If you remember, Paul, from our last few weeks of lessons, has been in Caesarea now for over 2 years. He was taken there by Lysias to protect him from the Jews who were trying to kill him. He had gone through one trial, had been found innocent. He went through a second trial, and in that trial had a chance of being found innocent, but he didn't trust Festus, the king or the representative of Rome who was there in Caesarea. And so he had appealed to Caesar, which was the right of a Roman citizen, to have their case heard by Caesar. So we're going to pick the story up, and you can kind of follow from city to city the voyage that Paul is going to be making. Now, as you're looking at this story, or looking at the route that's going to be traveled, the prevailing wind at this time of year, which is late September, early November, the prevailing wind is from the southeast. It's from this direction, which is really kind of blowing against what you're trying to do. You're trying to sail west, but the prevailing wind is coming from the southeast, kind of blowing into your face. So they're leaving kind of at a bad time, late in the year, and the story picks up. Chapter 27, verse 1. When it was decided that we would sail for Italy to meet with Caesar, they proceeded. Now this is Luke writing, and Luke's writing in the first person, so we know he's been present, he's there. They decided to deliver Paul and some other prisoners. So it wasn't just Paul that was being taken to Rome. There were quite a few other prisoners. And they turned him over to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. So how many people were under a centurion? A centurion was a commander over what was called a century. How many men was that? 100. It's 100 men. For what it's worth, a cohort was made up of 6 centuries, but he was from the Augustan cohort. He was a centurion. He was over 100 men. So on this boat, there's 100 soldiers, and we don't know how many prisoners. It doesn't give us an exact number, but it's quite a few prisoners. Paul is not the only prisoner. He is no doubt the most famous of the prisoners. People would have known him. They would have known he was a man of God. He had already made 3 other missionary journeys around the Mediterranean basin, so he was known as a man of God among the prisoners, among the soldiers. By the way, when you read Acts, Luke is very kind to centurions. Throughout the story of Acts, there are several different times where centurions are friends of Christians and are receptive to the gospel. And so, in this case, Paul's being delivered over to a centurion named Julius and embarking in an Amdratian ship. Now, what is an Amdratian ship? An Amdratian ship is just one that was built in Adrium. Adrium was a seaport in northwest Asia, and the main industry there was building ships. So when they talked about this ship, it was describing where it was built. They tended to build the same ship over and over. Now, when we say ship, this thing was pretty good size. It was 100 feet long. Typically, their boats there were about 100 feet. That's a good sized boat. And these boats would scuttle passengers and goods kind of all around the Mediterranean and the different ports. They were kind of at what's called a shallow draft. They didn't displace too much water, so they could go into shallow ports, and they were a very popular ship for traveling. And it was about to sail to the regions along the coast of Asia, and we, which tells us Luke was there, put out to sea, this is in verse 2, and we were accompanied by Aristarchus. If you've got your handout there, who is the traveling companion of Paul that spent more time with Paul than any other of his traveling companions, with the exception of Luke, and maybe in the early days, Silas? And it's Aristarchus. Aristarchus was from Thessalonica. He was very close to Paul. And matter of fact, when Paul gets imprisoned at different times, Aristarchus is in prison with him. The only one of Paul's followers that we know that actually served time in jail or in prison, other than Silas, with Paul. So Aristarchus, Luke points out that Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, is traveling with him. Verse 3, the next day we put in at Sidon. Sidon's only about, if you look on your map, it's a short distance, maybe 20 or 30 miles. They're probably still collecting goods to carry, to transport. They're trying to fill the ship up. And it's an interesting thing here. Julius allows Paul to get off the boat to visit with friends and to receive some special care. Now that's very unusual. And it's interesting that Luke would even point this out. But again, Julius had some affinity or trust relationship with Paul more than a normal prisoner. Verse 4, and from there we put out to sea, and we sailed under the shelter of Cyprus because the winds were contrary. What does that mean, the winds were contrary? It means that it was kind of blowing in their face. And when it says under the protection, if you look at your map right here, if the wind is coming from the southeast, if you could sail kind of close to this island, Crete, that would give you some protection from the wind. So they did that, and then they didn't want to get out here in the middle of the sea because the wind was pretty bad. So they're kind of bumping along the coast here of Asia and moving on over to their next stop. And it said that, verse 5, and when we had sailed through the sea along the coast of Sicilia, where Tarsus was, Paul's hometown, and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra in the state of Lycia. Now, to give you this, Myra was a busy shipping center. And the reason was Rome, at this point in time, probably had close to 1 million people in the city of Rome. It was huge. If you can think of all the issues in those days with that infrastructure, to support 1 million people, that was a touch and go job. Just even the job of supplying water, dealing with garbage, dealing with sewage was a huge job. But the biggest job was, where do you get enough food to support 1 million people? You got to have bread every day. What is the supply line? At that time, I know this is hard to believe, there were no HEBs. There were no Krogers. There were no big department stores where you could pop down to the corner and buy your food. A steady supply of food into Rome was a huge problem. Also, there are no freezers, so the food has to always be fairly fresh. Now, where was all this food coming from? All this wheat. It was coming from Egypt. It was being grown in Egypt. And if you look on your map, you see the little city of Alexandria right here in Egypt. Because of the prevailing winds, again, coming out of the southeast, the normal route to get grain into Rome was they would sail straight north to Lycia, to Myra. And then they would stop, get more supplies, drop off people, whatever, and then, staying fairly close to shore, they would make the trip on over. So it was an elbow trip. They would go north, to Myra, and then west toward Rome. So Myra was a bustling city in those days. Verse 6. There, the centurion found an Alexandrian ship that was sailing for Italy, and he put us on it. Now, why the Alexandrian ship? One was it was going to Rome all the way, which is where they needed to get to, but an Alexandrian ship was 180 feet long. Think about that for a minute. We're not talking about the Nina and the Pinta and the Santa Maria. We're not talking about, little boats that Columbus, 1,500 years later, would use to discover America. I don't know if you've ever been on any of those, but they're tiny. This boat, these Alexandrian ships that were built for the purpose of transporting grain, they were big boats, 180 feet. If I can think of something, that's over half the length of a football field. That's about 60 yards. That's a long ways. For those days and that time, that's a big ship. So I want you to get your mind around the fact that as we continue the story, we're not talking about a little boat here. We're talking about boats that were 180 feet long, 45 feet wide, and because they had such heavy cargoes, they required about 45 feet of draft. In other words, the bottom of the boat, fully loaded, would be 45 feet underwater. These were big boats. Verse 7, and when we had sailed slowly for a good many days, I've underlined slowly and with difficulty. Why difficult? They're still dealing with this southeast wind. They arrive at a little island called Sanitas, and the wind just wouldn't permit us to go any further. The wind was too strong coming out of the southeast. But we sailed under the shelter of Crete off Salmone, which was about 110 miles. And if you look at your map, what they finally did, they're trying to avoid this southeast wind. So they headed to Crete, and the closer they got to Crete, the more and more protection they were getting from the southeast wind. So this whole trip, they're fighting this southeast wind, which was the normal prevailing wind, but it was worse later in the year. Verse 8, and with difficulty, sailing past it, coming to the southeast side where they're really getting the brunt of the wind, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lasea. Now, altogether, they have now traveled about 150 miles from Myra. When considerable time had passed, and the voyage was now dangerous. Now, they've been waiting, they've been looking for a break in the weather. The southeast wind is so strong, they're waiting for a better wind. But now, in verse 9, the voyage is not just difficult, but it's dangerous, since even the fast was already over. Now, what are they talking about, the fast? It was the celebration of the Day of Atonement. And on that day, for a 25-hour period, the Jews would fast. So when he says the fast was over, he's talking about the Day of Atonement. And we know that that was in late September, early November. The maritime rules in those days were that it was dangerous to be out there sailing after September 15th. We know we're past September 15th. And actually, by the time you're getting into November to November 15th, it was beyond dangerous. It just was totally foolhardy to be on the water. So the timing of all this is very bad. Now, Paul is a well-traveled guy. In all of his missionary journeys and everything else, especially for that day and time, he had spent a lot of time on ships. He knew all these sort of things. And so Paul began to admonish them, meaning he began to caution them strongly. Now, remember, Paul's probably the most famous guy on the ship. He doesn't have any authority, but he's well known. His relationship with God and the fact that he's a man of God is well known. And so when he speaks, they listen. They don't always follow his advice, but at least he can get a platform. He can talk. And he said to them, verse 10, "Men, I perceive that the voyage will certainly be with damage and great loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives." Paul says this thing has reached a point, we are likely to all die. Verse 11, "But the centurion was more persuaded by the pilot and the captain of the ship than he was by Paul." Now, what does it says here, the pilot? Some of your translations may say owner. The pilot was actually the owner of the ship. Some of your boats say captain of the ship, some say the helmsman, but the captain was the guy who was actually steering and responsible for the ship. But his boss, the owner, was there. But the final decision fell to the centurion. He was Rome's representative on the boat. So the owner, knowing that if they do make it to Rome with their wheat this time of year when there's not much wheat arriving, he's going to make a nice profit if they can get there. And he's willing to gamble. And of course, the captain works for the owner, so he's not going to cross him. And finally, they persuade Julius we're going to make a run for it. We're going to try to get there. Now, verse 12. "But the harbor there at Fair Havens was not suitable for wintering." In other words, the winds, and it didn't really have a good harbor there. They made a decision anyway. So they reached a decision to put out to sea from there. And if somehow they wanted to reach a port in Phoenix, if you look at your map, Phoenix was only about 70 miles. I mean, these ships with a good wind, without too much struggle, could sail 15, 20 miles an hour fairly easily. So that could have been a half-day sail or maybe a one-day sail, possibly, and they thought they would like to get there, maybe reconsider the situation. However, verse 13, a moderate south wind came up. So what had happened, the wind had swung around. It was coming in from the southeast, and it swung around to the south. Well, with the south wind, they could make pretty good progress, and they perceived that as maybe a sign that they're doing the right thing. So everyone who had a vote, the consensus became, the majority, reached a decision to put out to sea from there. And then a moderate south wind came up, and supposing they had attained their purpose, they weighed anchor and began sailing along Crete, trying to stay close inshore. Now, this verse, what we're talking about right here, is the fulcrum point in our story. Fulcrum point meaning what the decision that's going to be made right here is going to affect the lives and fortunes of everyone on that ship. This was a critical decision. And we're going to come back to this decision. Now remember, as we begin, because what happens after this gets even worse. What happens after this is these terrible things are going to happen, but remember, Paul's not even supposed to be there anyway. It wasn't God's choice. The Holy Spirit had warned Paul repeatedly not to go to Jerusalem, and he had gone anyway. He had gotten arrested. He had wasted over 2 years under house arrest there in Caesarea, and now God has, through Paul, has warned the captain of the ship, the owner of the ship, the centurion, anyone else who was standing there. He has said, we should not be doing this. We're already in trouble. Let's stay right here, forget trying to get to Rome right now. But the majority, the consensus was, let's try to make it to Rome. Now we're going to come back to this verse, but this is the verse where things go from bad to worse. Verse 14, but before very long, there rushed down from the land a violent wind called a Euraquilo. A Euraquilo, literally translated, means a northeaster. It can also be translated a cyclone. Hurricanes in that part of the world are called cyclones. And so almost immediately, they didn't have Doppler weather reports. They had no idea this thing was coming. And when it hit them very quickly. The wind has violently changed from a difficult southeast wind to now a powerful, dangerous, no telling how high the winds were, wind coming from the northeast. So their little plan to kind of scoot around to Phoenix, just a short half day, 1 day sail along the coast, is literally blown up. The wind is so powerful, they can't get into Phoenix. Matter of fact, the wind is so powerful, they begin to worry. If you look down on your map, down there on Africa, it's called the Citeria Major, that there's some very shallow water there in the Mediterranean. And remember, their boat it's got a real deep draft. They need deep water to sail that ship. They were afraid they were going to get blown into these shallow waters off the coast of Africa. The wind is so powerful. And so, verse 15, and when the ship got caught up in it, this hurricane, and we couldn't even start to face or control the wind, we gave way to it and let ourselves be driven along. What does it mean we gave way to it? What it means is we just dropped all the sails. I mean, there's no way the sails or the mast or anything. And remember, this boat's 180 feet long. This is a big boat. They just dropped the mast and just said, wherever the wind takes us, whatever the wind takes us from here, it just takes us. And if you look at the little map there, it just shows the squiggly line as they're being blown westward across the Mediterranean. Now, right now, have any of you ever been on a cruise ship or on a boat where the weather got really bad?
Yeah. I was in the Mediterranean on one during the knocked out windows in the ship and everything.
Estelle says she was on a cruise ship in the Mediterranean when the wind came up and it blew out windows.
I slept through it.
And Estelle said she could sleep while the wind blew. I was on a cruise ship one time with Adrian Rogers and some other preachers and people in the Mediterranean when a bad wind storm came up. And Delane and I were there listening to these preachers who were preaching in the main ballroom. And this one preacher we'll never forget, this ship is rocking so bad is that he's holding on to the pulpit, kind of like this. And then there were some drapes behind him, and those drapes would go, woo, woo, back. It really was funny, and you could barely walk down the halls holding on to the rails, and people were falling, and glasses were breaking, and even in the kitchen, any china or anything that wasn't locked down was breaking. You could hear glass breaking all over. The little gift shop got pretty well destroyed. So when you're in a storm like that, it can get really bad. And so they just dropped all their sails and they're just holding on. And so verse 16, and running under the shelter of a small island called Clauda, again trying to get some protection from the men, we were scarcely able to get the ship's boat under control. The ship's boat being a little skiff that they pulled behind the boat. And after we had hoisted it up on the ship, they used supporting cables to undergird the ship, trying to hold it together. And fearing that they might run aground in the shallows of Citrus, they let down the sea anchor, and in this way let themselves be driven along. What is a sea anchor? It's frequently, it's like a canvas or a sail that you throw onto the back of the boat. It's not an anchor that goes down to the ground. It just provides some drag to try to slow the ship down a little bit and to keep it pointed in the right direction. So when they say a sea anchor, this is not something they're dropping down to the floor of the ocean. It's too deep there anyway, but it just provided some drag to try to help control the ship, trying to get the ship under control. Okay, next, 18. And the next day it got worse. We were being, underlined, violently storm-tossed, big ship. And they begin to jettison the cargo. They're throwing things overboard. And on 19, on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard. Tackle meaning the equipment they used to sail the ship. Verse 20, and neither the sun nor the stars appeared for many days. What they're saying is it was so cloudy, so thick, they couldn't tell if it was night or day. I mean, it was dark. It was the same every 24-hour period. Black, dark. And there it says, neither sun nor stars, verse 20, appeared for many days. He doesn't even tell us. I think they lost track. They couldn't tell when it was day or night. And this was no small storm that was assailing us. And at that point, all hope of our being saved was gradually abandoned. Now, if you got your handout, when does God show up? When all hope's abandoned. You see, if God had shown up a minute earlier, the sailors would have said, boy, weren't we great sailors. It's a horrible storm, but we never gave up. We knew we had a plan. We were going to work it out. God normally does not show up until all hope's abandoned, to the point that when we go in for that second X-ray or PET scan and the cancer's mysteriously gone, that we don't say, you know, that was that special Joe Tippin protocol I was on. That was that fantastic doctor I had that saved me. When all hope is gone and we're saved, that's when we say we're saved by a power greater than anything anybody could have done. This is a God thing. So these men on this 180-foot long boat, there's not one guy on the boat that's saying we're going to make it. They were all in agreement. We're doomed. There is no hope. Verse 21, and when they had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up in the middle of them and said, men, don't you love someone that tells you, I told you so? He says, I told you so. Paul stood up in the midst and said, men, you ought to have followed my advice, not to have set sail for Crete and incurred this damage and loss. If you'd have only listened to me, we wouldn't be in this shape. I'm sure that inspired everybody. Verse 22, yet now I urge you to keep up your courage, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night, an angel of the God, underlined, to whom I belong, and whom I serve, stood before me. Now, the significance to this is, we're going to find out in a minute that there's, I think, 276 people on this ship, and there was probably, 200 different gods that these people had been praying to during this storm. This violent storm, when all hope's being lost, there are people all over the ship burning incense, doing whatever they can, praying to God, save us, save us, save us. But now all hope is lost. They know their gods have failed them. But Paul stands up and said, my God, the one true God that I serve and to whom I belong, has appeared to me with a message. All your gods failed. And he said, an angel stood before me from my God, and saying, verse 24, do not be afraid. Every time angels show up, angels must be awesome creatures, because every time one of them shows up, the first thing they say is, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. God has told you you're going to stand before Caesar, and you will. God has also granted you your prayer that all those who are sailing with you will also be saved. So when Paul was praying, he wasn't just praying for his own salvation, he was praying for the salvation of every person on that ship. Verse 25, therefore, this expression, keep up your courage, a more literal translation of that is be happy. In the midst of this, Paul is saying, be happy, guys. For I believe God, that it will turn out exactly as I have been told. But we are going to run aground on a certain island. You know, God doesn't take us out of the storm. He is with us in the storm. Verse 27, but then when the 14th night came, and I believe the 14th night is from after Paul had said this. It goes on for 2 more weeks. But when the 14th night came, as we were being driven about in the Adriatic Sea, about midnight, the sailors began to surmise that they were approaching some land. And they took soundings. They dropped weights down to see how deep the water was. And the first time, they found it to be 20 fathoms. Well, a fathom is about 6 feet, so it's 120 feet deep. That's actually pretty shallow. That part of the Mediterranean is 600 feet deep and up to thousands of feet deep. So 120 feet deep, that's pretty shallow. So maybe we're getting close to land. And they went on a little bit further. They took another sounding, and it was 15 feet. So it had gone from 120 feet of depth to 90 feet. One more sounding at that rate of getting shallower would have put them at the draft level of the ship. So they're thinking, man, this water is getting shallower quickly, and they among themselves had decided to abandon ship and take their chances in the little boat that they had pulled up on the boat, the one that usually trailed behind the ship. And so they decided that they were going to make a break for it. Verse 29, fearing that we might run aground somewhere on the rocks, these members cast 4 anchors from the stern, that's off the back, and they wished for daybreak. My Bible says wish, some say pray for daybreak. Verse 30, but the sailors were trying to escape from the ship, and they told everyone that they also needed to drop some anchors off at the front of the ship's boat on the pretense of intending to lay out anchors from the bow. But Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers, these guys are making a break for it. And unless these men remain in the ship, you yourselves cannot be saved. The soldiers immediately cut away the rope of the ship's boat, the skiff that could have been used, maybe, if they were close to land, to ferry people over, in small groups for them to be saved. But the centurions, when Paul said, I think at this point Julius is pretty much believing everything Paul's saying. Paul says if these guys escape, no one lives, they cut the ropes. So Julius at this point is listening to Paul. Verse 33, and then that day, it was about to dawn. Evidently the clouds had broken up a little bit. They knew it was dawn. Paul was encouraging them and said, guys, we need to eat some food. Today is the 14th day that you've been constantly watching and going without eating. You haven't eaten anything. Therefore, I encourage you to take some food. You're going to need your strength. For this is what's going to help us. We need it for our preservation. For not a hair of the head of any of you will perish. Having said this, he took bread and, underline in your Bible, gave thanks to God. Now, I believe everyone on that ship was watching him give thanks to God. Just like everyone in the cafeteria and everyone in the restaurant is watching you every time you put food in your mouth, they are watching to see if you have given thanks. That's the most powerful, one of the most powerful testimonies that we all have the opportunity to make every day. Paul gave thanks publicly in the presence, it says there, in the presence of all. And he broke it and began to eat. And they became encouraged. And they took some food. And then all of us in the ship were 276 persons. And when they had eaten enough, they began to lighten the ship by throwing out the wheat into the sea. I mean, they'd held on to that valuable wheat to the last minute. Verse 39, and when the day came, they could not recognize the land, but they did observe a bay, and it had a sandy beach. There were no rocks, and they resolved to drive the ship onto it if they could. And so they cut the anchors, they left them in the sea, while at the same time they were loosening the ropes of the rudders and hoisting the foresail. They put up one sail to try to help drive them onto the beach, and they were making good speed. They were headed right for the beach. Everyone's very encouraged. They hit a reef where two seas met. They ran the vessel aground, and the prow stuck fast and remained immovable, but the back of the boat began to suffer from the waves, and it began to break up. Now, the soldiers had a plan. If a Roman soldier let a prisoner escape, and they probably had dozens of them, they would have to take the punishment that was assigned to that prisoner. And there were probably some murderers in the group. So the soldiers had a plan. If worse comes to worse, we're going to kill all the prisoners, so that none of them would swim away and escape. 43. But Julius, wanting to bring Paul safely through, kept them from their intentions and commanded that those who could jump overboard and swim for it. And if you can't swim, grab a board, grab something that'll float, and you jump too. And the rest followed, some on planks, others on various things from the ship. And so it happened that they were all of them, all 276 were brought safely to land. What an incredible story of narrative theology. If you've got your handout, I'm going to quickly go through the life application part here. And of course, if y'all know Adrian Rogers, he was the prince of alliteration. And if you've got an Adrian Rogers Bible, in this area right here, he says that Paul had established himself as a man of God, going back to that decision when they had to make the decision back in verse 19, I think it was, about whether or not to go on, to try to sail, when Paul had advised them not to, was known as someone with a personal relationship with God and to whom God had imparted wisdom in the past. But what persuaded the majority to go against Paul and his God? I said Acts 17, I think that's Acts 27. Number one, it was compulsion. And I'm often guilty of this, and actually I don't even know if it's necessarily a bad thing, but there was the desire to do something. Faced with bad choices, faced with difficulty, there was this sense we've got to do something. Secondly, there was consultation. They consulted when they were making this bad decision with the experts. The ship's captain, the owner of the ship, some of the sailors. We as Christians need to be very slow and careful about advice we take from experts, whether it's marriage counseling or any kind of spiritual counseling of any kind. We need to make sure that these people are solid Christians that we get counseling from. You got to remember that experts, I think a guy said one day that the Titanic was designed and built by experts. However, the Ark was built by an amateur building his first ship. So experts are frequently wrong. According to the experts, in the year 2000, due to global warming, the whole globe was supposed to be covered in water. We are constantly told things by medical experts, things like gender is a matter of choice. These are experts who tell us all these things. So we have to be very careful when we are presented with expert advice. The other thing was, the third one was a sense of comfort. It would be so much better if we could just get 70 more miles over to Phoenix. I think I know how to handle this. Paul, sit down, shut up. And then I misinterpreted that south wind, the circumstances, as maybe a sign. You know, maybe this was the sign we're looking for, that it's okay, but it wasn't a sign from God. And then, of course, item number 5, which I don't have there, was consensus. In my experience, more often than not in every case, but more often than not, the majority is usually wrong. I have a good friend who made some tragic choices in his life, and each time that I have counseled him about those choices, one of his frequent replies was, "Everyone's doing it." Everyone's doing it. You know, if everyone's doing it, it must be okay. So we have to be very careful about the majority. The last 3 things. What did God do for Paul in the middle of the storm? One was he guarded him. He kept him safe. He kept everybody on that boat safe through the storm. He didn't take them out of the storm. He didn't make the storm go away, but he guarded them. Number 2, he gladdened them. He put a smile on their face. He said, guys, be happy. The ending is going to be okay. God is in control. Number 3, he guided Paul. God had a plan for Paul's life. He had told Paul, you will testify before Caesar and in Rome. God had a plan for Paul, and his sovereign will would not be undone. And the conclusion is, God will do the same for you. Lord, we come before you with an humble heart. We thank you for this opportunity to meet together and study your word. Lord, we thank you for this exciting narrative and all the lessons that are in it about your sovereignty and your power and your desire to bless those who are in your will. Dear God, we just pray that we would be comforted by these things and that you would take us through this week, bring us back together next week to study your word with eternal brothers and sisters in Christ. In your Son's name we pray. Amen.
Jesus.